our Elul programming at Congregation Beth Sholom. My name's Rabbi Amanda Russell. I know most everybody here, but good to be with all of you today at lunch, Seeds of Mussar. Just to give a quick introduction with Rabbi Ira Stone, I'll let him tell you about himself, but just to say that I know Rabbi Stone for many, many years. He officiated my bat mitzvah and then my wedding. And so it's really a privilege to be sharing a coast and sharing a screen and everything else with Rabbi Stone. And you're all in for a real treat. And that's all I'll say. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Russell. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be with your congregation. And I'm looking forward to the Seeds of Mussar program over the next 5 or so weeks. And hopefully as a way of entering into the spirit of Elul, despite the strange world that we are living in right now. I'm actually not going to take much time introducing myself. Looking over the names, I think a lot of you were at the 2 sessions that I did, one Rabbi Russell's class and one Rabbi Ains' class. If there's some downtime along the way in the course of these 5 weeks, hopefully I'll say a few things about myself, but I really don't want to take time going over my bio. Just trust me that I've been around a long time. So what I really want to do is start, and that is to introduce you to the Seeds of Mussar project. Let me just preface that by introducing not me, but the Center for Contemporary Mussar, which is the organization that I am the Rosh Yeshiva of. This organization grew out of the work that I began at my synagogue, Temple Beth Zion, Beth Israel, almost 20 years ago now. And it was the beginning was a culmination of almost 30 years of my own personal and private study of Mussar, and exactly what Mussar is, etc., and its history I'll talk about in another few minutes. But Mussar was something that interested me from the time that I was a student in rabbinical school. It was not something that was taught in rabbinical school. I don't believe it still is something that is taught in rabbinical school, yet it constitutes a significant piece of both the Jewish literary tradition as well as a movement. When it began as the Mussar movement, it constitutes a fairly sizable piece of 19th and 20th century Jewish history, but it basically disappeared for reasons that we can go into at some other time, and was really not recognized as being part of the tradition, even in the Orthodox world, let alone in the conservative and Reform world. When I came to the rabbinate, I came primarily because of the influence of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I came to it out of a background of what seems like deja vu right at this moment, which is the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. When I got to rabbinical school, I was really looking for something that would represent the kind of Judaism that Rabbi Heschel inspired in me as a person involved in, let's call it generally the ethical issues of the day. And while I loved rabbinical school, that really didn't happen. And so I began to search, and I found Mussar, and I began to study it, to look at its texts, look at its history, and find out as much about it as I could. And I continued that for really, literally, probably 30 years. When I was in rabbinical school, my first philosophy teacher was Rabbi Harold Shulai, Shalom. Some of you out there will have known him. My first paper for Rabbi Shulai was about the possibilities for a contemporary Mussar movement. And Rabbi Shulai gave me an A in the paper, but he wrote a comment. And the comment was, what are you going to do about the theology? By which he meant that the theology, on the surface at least, of most Mussar texts is rather fundamentalist, more so perhaps even than any other part of Jewish literature. Kind of like God is in God's heaven and God is watching you, and if you're good, you'll be punished, you'll be rewarded, and if you're bad, you'll be punished. And Rabbi Schulweis anticipated that this was not a theology that I subscribe to, nor certainly would it be a theology that my constituents ultimately would subscribe to. So I spent the next 30 years looking to answer Rabbi Schulweis's question. And I found that answer through the work of the French Jewish philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas. Now, we're not going to speak very much about Levinas, but I mention him because it is a significant influence on the way that our contemporary Mussar has developed. And some of that we'll get to today. So, finally, I formed a group, and I tried to institute a contemporary Mussar practice, and that has grown over the years into the Center for Contemporary Mussar. We have groups all over the country, and I mention all this because, in part, the hope of these Seeds of Mussar project is that some of you will, in fact, decide to continue with our full curriculum, which would be a commitment made outside the purview of the synagogue program, directly with the center, and which I hope that we'll be able to form a group of people from your congregation, and we could then supply you with a madrich, with a teacher, and the program would extend way beyond what we're going to be doing in this introductory couple of weeks. To that end, let me just ask Rabbi Russell if it's possible for me to get a copy of the email addresses of people who are in this group so that I can put them on the center's mailing list with their permission, so that you can hear that you could receive our newsletter. For example, we have a program that's been going on for the last 2 weeks and will be going on for another couple of weeks on Wednesday evenings that's open to everybody for free, in which different rabbis in our Mussar group are teaching for the month of Elul. Okay, I'm going to take a breath because I see some complaints about the audio. I don't know that I can do anything about that. I'm not sure if it's the technology or it's my voice, which does tend to be a little scratchy and maybe is worse coming across the technology, but I hope that you can understand me well enough to profit by it. Okay, so what are we going to do? What is Seeds of Mussar? So it's basically a 5-week introduction to review the practice and particularly the tools of the practice of Mussar. So let me be clear. We're not actually going to be doing the practice, though we may do some occasional sampling. What we're going to be doing is learning about the practice and learning about what the tools of that practice are. Again, in part to interest you in wanting to then go ahead in a substantive kind of way to involve yourself in this. And let me emphasize the word practice. While in the course of being involved in the Mussar curriculum, our students do experience a fairly intense exposure to some Jewish texts, particularly some classical Mussar texts. The important part of this program is not intellectual, right? So while this program, the Seeds program, will tend to be my lecturing more than I would like, in the actual Mussar program, the lecturing is much less front and center, and the practice is, right? We're interested more in the emotional, psychological, if you will, um, um, pieces of this practice, and the intellectual takes something of a backseat, right? It is certainly present, but it takes something of a backseat. So normally we would start our program, even today, by sort of getting ourselves comfortable, making sure we're seated comfortably, our feet are on the floor. We have a good place to breathe. We do some breathing exercises in the course of the Mussar practice, which we're not going to get right into today. But we usually start with a nigun. Right? Rabbi, if you could put that first page up. The nigun that we usually sing is to start our sessions is called Elohai Nishama. And I'm putting it up here so you can just see it. It's the first line of the prayer in the early morning prayers. Most of you, I'm sure, know it. Elohai Nishama Shenatati Bi Tahorahi. O pure, the soul that you have given me, O God, you have returned to me in purity. And we use this Shefa Gold translation, O pure soul, in you I see endless possibility. Now, the problem is that in my experience, singing in Nigun on Zoom is fruitless because nobody can hear anybody and everybody can hear only me. And my singing of the Nigun is actually going to cause you all to leave rather than to be drawn closer. So I think we're going to skip the Nigun, but I wanted you to get to see it and know about it, because right off the bat, in my opinion, that sets this program off, right? This is not simply about learning, it's about experiencing. It's not simply about thinking and reading and studying. It's about contemplating, if you will, the soul and the purity of the soul. But what we can do together, and which we also do as we open each session, is to say the blessing before studying Torah. And while we may or may not be studying specifically from the Torah today, what we are doing here does constitute the study of Torah in a general sense. So I would ask those of you who want to join me in the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu v'mitzvotav b'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, you can take that off the screen. And yes, I'm very well aware that Rabbi Russell could sing this beautifully for us, but the problem with that is that it doesn't solve the problem. It's still us listening to her rather than being drawn together in a group in singing the nigun. Okay, so now let's talk about the basic Mussar vocabulary. First of all, a little bit about the history. The word Mussar literally means discipline. And it means discipline in the same three senses that we use that word in English. That is, it refers to a genre of literature, right? A corpus of study, just as we often talk about the discipline of biology or the discipline of law or the discipline of medicine, etc. It also refers to the idea of correction, just as we use the word discipline to indicate that someone needs to have their behavior corrected. And it also refers to discipline in the sense of practice, right? So just as we refer to ourselves as being disciplined in practicing the piano or anything else, so also Mussar requires practice. So all three of those terms are included in the word Mussar, and all three of those terms represent something about both Mussar historically as well as in practice. The development of Mussar is a little bit of like any ancient literary genre. is a little bit hard to actually pinpoint, right? So there are elements of Mussar literature, and the word Mussar itself appears in biblical literature. The most famous storehouse or treasury of Mussar ideas, that we find in the biblical tradition occurs in the book of Proverbs, right? The word there is used a variety of times, and it is often used as a kind of equivalent of Torah, right? So there's a verse in Proverbs that says, Shema b'ni, listen my son, to the Mussar of your mother and the Torah of your father, right? Mussar imecha Torah abecha. So so the Torah seems to, or the Proverbs seem to indicate that Mussar is a kind of component of Torah. Similarly, in the rabbinic period, we get lots of Mussar, lots of things identified as being Mussar. And mostly they have to do with ideas around ethical behavior, right? And if we think about, in particular, the Talmud is divided, generally speaking, into two major sections. One is halacha, Jewish law, and the other is agadah, Jewish narrative. And the narrative usually provides often provides the ethical raison d'etre for the halachic observance. So in some sense, one could say that Mussar will eventually represent or even take the place of agadah as Jewish literature develops. But Mussar literature per se is recognized as having begun in the 9th century with the first book of identifiable Mussar text known as Chovot HaLevavot, the obligations of the heart, by Rabbi Bachya ibn Pekuda in Egypt in the 10th century. Now, there are two important things that we learn from Bachya. Number one, based on the name of the book, the duties of the heart. Bachya seems to be responding to the development in Jewish life, beginning around that same period, of the codification of Jewish law. So Jewish law begins to be extracted out of the Talmudic milieu and organized and codified as a freestanding entity, which was important for good historical reasons because the law had become so complicated, et cetera, et cetera. But Bachya and others feared that by taking the halacha and extracting it out of the Talmud and out of the narrative, it would leave the impression that only the halacha mattered, that the halacha was the goal, that observing halacha was the goal of Jewish law. And it would lose the narrative which would assert that the goal of Jewish life is not to observe halacha, but rather the goal of halacha is to help us achieve a life of holiness. And the holiness is defined almost exclusively from the biblical period onward in terms that we today would call ethical. Obviously, the holiness code in the book of Leviticus is particularly characterized by its central verse, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Ki ani Adonai kadosh, because I am holy, you shall be holy. So what it means to be holy, essentially, is to love the other, to love your neighbor. And Bachya was afraid that by focusing on the duties of the guf, the body, the duties of the heart would be overlooked. That's the first point. The second point is that Bachya himself was a mystic. He was a Kabbalist before that term was actually derived. And it turns out that almost all the great Mussar writers from that time until today were also mystics or Kabbalists. So there is some kind of close relationship between the development of Kabbalah, which by the 13th century and all the way through the mid-19th century was the central theological platform of all Jewish life. Right? Kabbalistic theology was theology of Judaism from at least the 10th century until the 19th century. And the goal of that theology, of course, was to create a kind of mystical union with the divine. But such a mystical union was impossible unless a person had already perfected his or her character. So Bachya's goal, and the goal of every Mussar writer afterwards, was to A, remind us that halacha is not the end, but a means to the end, and B, that the means to the end requires the perfection of our character. And so in a way that I think kind of defines Mussar. It is the literature that teaches, instructs, cajoles individuals to look to their own character, to the way in which they are relating to the others around them, to the other people around them. Okay. I have a couple more things to say about this, and then I'm going to stop and give you a chance to ask some questions. Though I have a lot more to do. So the Mussar, therefore, until the middle of the 19th century, referred entirely to this literary tradition. And I could list you many different books from the 10th century, the 12th century, the 15th century, the 17th century, even into the 20th century, of books that are part of this literary tradition. But something occurred in the middle of the 19th century to change our understanding of the word Mussar. And that was the work of Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin of Salant in Lithuania, known as the Salanter Rav. Now, what the Salanter essentially did was wonder, if you will, if we have all of this information, if we have all these books, the Torah, the Talmud, the Mussar books, everything that tell us how to be good people, why is it so hard to be good? Right? Why is it that we persist in our selfishness, in our unkindness, in our susceptibility to cheat and to lie, etc.? And Salanter answered in a very 19th century way that the reason is because our behavior is not controlled by our conscious mind. And that just reading or studying does not go deeply enough into what we would call our psyche to alter our behavior. And so therefore something else was necessary. And he created a program, a very 19th century, many similarities to the kind of psychological investigations and explorations that were going on in the late 19th century, in which people were given a program of introspection, which would hopefully break through their conscious mind and their defenses, and lower those defenses so that they could relate more effectively with the people around them, right? So he started a program of cheshbon hanefesh, of accounting of the soul, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is already an ancient rabbinic tradition in particular one that we talk about in this month of Elul. Secondly, he instituted what he called studying with lips aflame. That is, not just reading texts, but singing them, chanting them, repeating them over and over again in order to somehow internalize them, to somehow have them break through. He had people meet in groups called a vad, in which they would share their work, their exploration of their own character, based on a series of what are called midot, or traditional character traits. Now, there are many different lists of midot. The one that Salanter chose came from a book called Cheshbon HaNefesh by Rabbi Moshe Leffin, a Eastern European rabbi in the 18th century. And Leffin's book, Nefesh HaChaim, interestingly enough, was based in part on one of the most popular philosophers of the Enlightenment period, right? The 18th and early 19th, well, mostly 17th, late 17th and early 18th century. And I'm going to ask you to guess who that was, but since we don't have time, I'm going to tell you. And that's Benjamin Franklin. In Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, he writes about the virtues, and he lists 13 virtues, and he makes a chart. He creates a chart of those virtues so that a person could check off every day how they're doing in their achieving these virtues. So I'm always fond of saying that really, in a lot of ways, Mussar began in Philadelphia, which is where I'm at, right? In any case, Moshe Levin copied from Benjamin Franklin that list of midot, and he even copied the chart so that it appears in Leffin's Nefesh HaChaim exactly the way it does in Benjamin Franklin's book. And Salanter republished Nefesh HaChaim along with another classic Mussar text that has become the foundation of our practice, and that is called Mesirat Yesharim, the Paths of the Upright, by the 18th century Jewish thinker Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And so these two books together constituted the study material for the Vad in the yeshivot of Rabbi Salanter. The Mussar movement that Salanter started grew. It became fairly important in both Lithuanian and Polish Jewry and spread even beyond that. It had a tremendous influence on the development of Hasidic thinking, though it was not a Hasidic movement. But it pretty much came to an end in the First World War with the destruction of Jewish communities in Russia and in Eastern Europe. And then whatever was left of it was further destroyed, of course, during the Shoah. And that kind of brings us up to current day history, where, as I said, about 30 years ago, two people independently in America discovered Mussar, began to rethink it as an option for Jewish spiritual practice. One is myself, and the other is, some of you may have heard of Alan Marinis, who runs what is called the Mussar Institute. Alan and I began our work pretty much at the same time. When he was writing his first book on Mussar called Climbing Jacob's Ladder, he found me because I was on the internet at that time, which was very new, because I was teaching a class in Mussar at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he was just sort of searching Mussar and came upon me. And we shared some of our experiences, read each other's work. And in fact, his invitation to me to speak at the first Mussar Institute Kala in New York was where I met the students from Philadelphia who would eventually be the students in my Mussar program. So And we've then developed separately since then. Okay, I've got a lot of more material that I want to cover, but I'm going to just stop. I saw some questions. Somebody asked, is the same period as the Mussar, the Masoretic text? Actually, the Masoretic text, I think, is a little bit earlier. So maybe the 800 rather than 900s. Sanford Goldstein has raised his hand.
Hi, Rabbi Sandy. I have a quick question, but don't answer it if it's irrelevant. If halakha is one of the things that makes Judaism distinctive, was there a concern by Rabbi Bachi or any time since that making the primary or one of the primary things and goals of Judaism is to live ethically, that it would somehow decrease the distinctiveness of Judaism and allow people to think that my goal is to live ethically and I can do that in many ways, even among Jews?
Okay, that's a great question, Sandy. Most of the Mussar texts begin by referring to what I call the both the genius and the Achilles heel of Judaism, which is the centrality of halakha. It is Judaism's genius precisely because how to live, because living ethically, how should I begin? In other words, if we take Rabbi Salanter's question seriously, right? If we know what's right, why don't we do it? And if we answer it in a very sort of superficial way, just for today, just for this purpose, the reason we don't do it is because something gets in the way. Either we fall asleep to our ethical responsibilities. And the reason we fall asleep is because we're afraid. And when we're afraid, we tend to purposely not see what's right in front of us. So to put it as quickly and as concisely as I can, halakha is the methodology by which we stay awake. Halakha interrupts our self-absorption. And only by interrupting our self-absorption can we then access, if you will, our ability to serve the other. So most Mussar texts, so that's what halakha does best. However, halakha equally has the tendency to devolve into rote. And you just start observing the halakha without being aware that the purpose of the halakha is precisely to interrupt your self-absorption. And so the whole purpose of Mussar was to, in fact, remind a halachic observing community that the purpose of halakha is not halakha, that the purpose of halakha is to wake you up and keep you awake, right? So in the contemporary milieu, the answer to the person who says, well, I'm going to be ethical and I don't need anything else, is to simply say, if you can do that, kol hakavod. But since you're human, you probably can't do that. You're going to need some kind of external program of self-interruption. And that program is halakha. Whether it's the exact traditional halakha or some other kind of halakha, but you need something, right? Conversely, I believe that Mussar and its ethical sensibility then becomes a measuring rod for the halachic process. So if the goal of halakha is to wake us up and to interrupt our self-absorption so that we can serve the other, then when and if, because of historical reasons, halakha actually becomes an agent of oppression and excludes the other from our viewpoint, then that halakha needs to be changed on the basis of Mussar. Now, keep in mind, I'm a card-carrying conservative rabbi. I believe that the halacha is a historical process, not given by the word of God, right? So I believe that what is given by the word of God is the sense that we are obligated to serve our neighbor. That's the divine command. The halacha is the way the Jewish people have historically articulated that demand. And I believe that halacha, to a large degree, has become frozen and needs to be rethought in terms of its overriding purpose. Hope that answers your question. Gary has a question.
Hello, Rabbi. It's nice to see you again. I remember you from Walter Cohen's funeral, God rest his soul. I was one of the people that gave the obituary.
Very nice to see you again.
Yes, the question I have is, does Mussar correspond to keeping an awareness level?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think the goal of Mussar is to stay awake, to be awake to our obligations and our responsibilities. And again, if I can use this metaphor of sleep versus wakefulness, right? So sleep is the way in which we protect ourselves. And of course, I'm not talking only about literal sleep, although we do that too, right? When we're upset, oftentimes the first thing we want to do is go to bed, right? So being sleepy, metaphorically speaking, is a way in which we defend ourselves and close ourselves off from the other. And Mussar, using halacha as one of its tools, but enlarging the toolkit, as it were, to include cheshbon hanefesh and focusing on the mitot, is a way of keeping ourselves as insomniac as possible. Right? The ultimate saint, which no one really could achieve, is to be completely awake all the time. One might say that the only person who's ever achieved that status would be Moshe Rabbeinu. Judah, you have a question.
Yeah, during Elul, what we do is Heshbon HaNefesh, whether we name it that or not. And I'm just curious, I mean, I know Rabbi Solanta got it from that other man who published the other rabbi from the 1800s. He got his middah from the book Heshbon HaNefesh. But I'm curious if it is in our earlier literature from much before that.
Yes, both the idea of Heshbon HaNefesh and various lists of midot predate Salanter by many, many centuries, going back into the Talmud. The difference with Salanter is not so much that he invents midot, far from it, but that he organizes it and that he creates a program for using the midot in a very specific way. In rabbinic literature, Cheshbon HaNefesh is a kind of nebulous idea. You should look into your soul. Well, what does that mean? How do you do that? Well, Salanter basically looked at that and said, well, here's how you do it. Right, here's how you do it. You take one middah a week, you study it, you track your ability to maintain that middah in your personal relationships. In our case, we use a journal, right? So our Cheshbon HaNefesh program requires that each person set aside 15 minutes or half an hour, 20 minutes a night to do Cheshbon HaNefesh, to have a journal. And the journal that we ask people to keep, by the way, is not a narrative, right? You don't sit down and start saying, well, today I went to the store and this and this and that. Rather, we've created a protocol, a series of questions. And those questions direct your mind and your attention to this process, right? So we'll ask you to identify a moment in which you were triggered by another person, right? That's a Yetzer Hara moment. And we would ask you to say, well, what, for example, what were you afraid of? Right? And then we would suggest the next question would be, was that fear legitimate? Right, I mean, if the fear is legitimate, if somebody's going to do something to you, then so-called Yetzer Hara behavior is appropriate. But if it wasn't legitimate, can you use the middah, let's say the middah of savlanut, of patience, right? The book Cheshbon Nefesh defines patience as when something is unavoidable, don't make it worse with wasted grief. And that's what patience is according to Cheshbon Nefesh. How many of us, even when we encounter, or often when we encounter situations that we can't do anything about, it's too late, something's happened, and yet we spend hours on, for all intents and purposes, is wasted grief, and exacerbate the situation through that process. So looking at that situation through the eyes of the middah, we might say, can you imagine being in that situation again and not getting stuck in that cycle of wasted grief? And what would it look like, right? And then maybe one of the questions would be, well, what are you going to take away from this? How could you use this experience to grow? Something like that. So we have a specific protocol of questions, right? Rather than just sitting down and sort of, abstractly thinking about our behavior, we focus in on specific moments and specific situations, and we ask specific questions, and we try to determine what middah in that situation could have helped us such that we would not have closed up, and we would have been able to maintain our equilibrium, and etc. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so
Actually, Rabbi Stone, it looks like Lucy, who's not on screen, has her hand. Is that a question down there?
okay, sorry, I didn't see that. Thank you.
That's okay.
Lucy.
I saw.
Okay, Rabbi, I wanted to ask you, how does Mussar relate to the metaphysical study of ontology? Is it close?
I think we would need to spend a little bit more time unpacking what you mean by metaphysical study of ontology.
Well, ontology teaches you to be present, to be responsible for what you're doing, and to choose how you're going to behave in the moment. So would Mussar be related to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, just as a simple answer, I'm going to say yes. I mean, again, I'm not sure where you're getting that, where you're locating that teaching from. I mean, ontology is a big field. It sounds like you're talking about existentialism, and there certainly are some similarities. But, my first field of study is philosophy and theology. So I can get off on a whole long discussion of ontology and Heidegger and Husserl and Levinas, who is a critic of Heidegger, and we would be lost in the woods and we wouldn't get anywhere. So I'm going to kind of just answer that question as simply as I can and say, if what you mean by ontology is what you just said, then yes, Mussar is certainly a practice which would be similar. Again, the difference would be here, however, that I want to stress, that there may be a variety of philosophical and theological and religious traditions that are very similar to Mussar. It does not need to be unique for it to be important to us. On the other hand, what is, it seems to me, to be somewhat unique, although again, not entirely, is that rather than thinking about these issues, Mussar is about doing something about them, about actually spending day-to-day practice, right? In a sense, doing what halacha should be doing, right? If you could keep in mind when you are putting on tefillin in the morning and reciting the brachot and reading the Shema, etc., that those actions are ultimately meant to interrupt your self-absorption and point you toward your obligation to bear the other as your burden, to bear your neighbor in love, then I suppose there would be no need for Mussar. But Mussar is the recognition that these practices have a tendency to become rote, and that when they become rote, they lose their value, right? So I guess that's what I want to say is important about that. Okay, now I think we're done with questions for the moment. So I want to talk about today the idea of metaphor. Really, one of the core ideas of the Center for Contemporary Mussar program is the idea of metaphor, right? Obviously, we know that metaphors compare one thing to another, and that they're necessary when we're trying to describe abstract ideas that are in some ways ultimately impossible to articulate specifically in language. And so the idea of metaphor is important in three ways, or two ways maybe. Number one, we read the traditional Mussar texts and we understand that the language of those texts is metaphoric, that they are not meant to be read literally, and that our job in particular as contemporary readers is to unpack those metaphors, potentially repackage them in language that speaks more directly to us today than the language that they chose centuries ago that spoke to them. So, for example, the very idea of God, right? The word God functions in traditional literature as a metaphor. It doesn't capture a picture of a being, right? But rather captures the intuition, if you will, of an infinite command which translates the divine energy into human terms. So when we speak of God, we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of thinking of God as just being another person, bigger and more powerful than us, but rather unpack the word so that we can appreciate that its true meaning, if you will, is this intuition as human beings, and that so many human beings have had throughout all history, that there is an infinite source that commands us to love the other. That's God. Similarly, we use the term Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. We shouldn't think of this as some kind of little Dybbuk sitting on our shoulder, making us do bad things, but rather we should understand it as an intrinsic part of human psyche, whose purpose is to help us maintain our individual selfhood. But when it overpowers our ability to in fact love the other, it becomes not self-preservation, but self-absorption. And when it becomes self-absorption, it creates ra, or evil. Right? Conversely, Yetzer Tov refers to the equally indigenous part of our psychic makeup that wants to serve the other, that wants to do good, and is impeded by the growth of the Yetzer Hara, or the self-absorption tendency. We have found it useful to use another series of metaphors to explain, if you will, this paradigm. Based on the biblical opening chapters of Genesis, we identify three energy sources, if you will. One is Ruach, right? The Bible opens with the fact that the Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hayam, right? That the Ruach, the Spirit of God, hovered over the face of the deep. All right, so we identify the Ruach as being the source of divine energy in the universe. And then moving through Genesis, we recognize that the human being is considered to be a nefesh chai, a living creature. So the creatureliness of the human being is identified by the nefesh. Sometimes we translate that word as soul, but it's only one of the words that in Hebrew that we use for soul. So it can be a little confusing. Therefore, we prefer almost really not to translate it at all. Nefesh. Nefesh is your being, your personality, your body, as well as your psychic world. And then finally, we recognize that into this nefesh, in the biblical story, the Ruach breathed by virtue of neshama, also another word used for soul. Right? So the neshama is the, so to speak, the breath of the divine, which animates the nefesh and connects the nefesh to the ruach. And so when the individual has a nefesh that is strong enough to maintain its integrity, but open enough or permeable enough to allow the neshama to flow back and forth between it and the ruach, then we have the situation in which that we consider to be ideal. So the goal, as it were, of Mussar is to learn how to keep our nefesh from closing, or to keep it from disappearing altogether so that we have no personal integrity, but rather to keep it in a state of semi-permeability so that the neshama can flow and encounter the neshama of others around us. So this is another metaphoric paradigm to kind of describe the process that we want to talk about in trying to affect our behavior. Right? So one of the things that we'll do in the actual practice is to try to locate in our body some place where we can identify what happens to us when our nefesh closes, right? When we feel attacked, when we feel somebody is not listening to us. Somebody is not responding appropriately to us. What happens in our body? Do we tense up in our shoulders, in the pit of our stomach, in our breathing? And we want to then try to go back and test that spot and see whether through a series of questions and cheshbon nefesh, we can actually open that nefesh and allow the neshama to flow again. Recognizing, again, I want to underscore that this is metaphor. I have no idea if there's really such a thing as a nefesh, a neshama, or a ruach. They are words that represent intuitive phenomena in the experience of being human. Right? We can feel ourselves close off. We can feel ourselves reopen when we can disarm the fears that interfere with our relationships with others. Right? Okay. Let me see if I think that really covers the introductory material. So the goal of Mussar, to sort of repeat, is to cultivate our capacity to move our Yetzer from Ra to Tov, or to use the other paradigm, to learn how to maintain, in the face of all of our interactions with others, a semi-permeable nefesh. And to do that takes practice. And so one of the things we'll do, as I said, we will look at incidences in our lives where we can recognize that our nefesh closed. And we'll ask a series of questions that will try to analyze that response and help us create a habit of responding differently. It's really kind of training the muscle memory of the soul. Okay, any questions before we close? So for next time, what I'd like to do is ask you to bring to class a Mussar moment, a moment in the coming week in which you were triggered by another person. You became irritated, frustrated, annoyed, jealous, embarrassed, uncentered because of the reaction of a person. Maybe you'll try to figure out where in your body you experienced that trigger. And we'll ask you to think about, during that moment, what was the state of your nefesh, if you can imagine, right? Did you feel closed, open, too far open, etc.? So we'll kind of delve into that a little bit next time. I don't want anybody to bring in anything too personal. Once you actually get into a Mussar program, confidentiality becomes an absolute sine qua non. But since we're just kind of playing around with it, I want to trust in a certain level of confidentiality, but I don't want to depend on it. So bring in something that you feel comfortable sharing with other people around, and recognize that it may not be entirely confidential. And if you're not comfortable, then we have more than enough people in this group that I think we'll probably get one or two people to volunteer. So I guess that's it. I will see you next Tuesday. And in the interim, feel free to email me if you have questions, if you want to pursue something more directly, or if anything I said was confusing. I'm trying to get as much into this 1 hour as I possibly can, and it's a little bit tricky. So my email is Rosh Yeshiva, in one word, Rosh Yeshiva, at contemporarymussar.org. And Rabbi Russell just put it in the chat. Okay. Rabbi Russell, do you have any last words?
Thank you, Rabbi Stone. I don't have anything to say except for thank you and lots for us to think about. And yeah, I'll see everybody next week, same time, same place. Links are all on the website. I guess the one thing I do want to say